And okay. And so after a couple of months off, I've decided to start doing these Facebook Lives again, imaginatively titled On Writing and Such. So this is when I talk about my books, talk about writing in general, pray somebody's listening. Um, and I talk about writing and such, as the name implies. So since I took a couple months off for the holidays and trying to deal with work-related stress, unfortunately, I'm still dealing with work-related stress, but unfortunately, that's not going to go away anytime soon. I decided to go back to the beginning and start talking about the the books. So starting from the very first one. So the very first one that I published with eyes open. Here's the cover. It's actually um, it's actually two stories. The first one is the title story with eyes open, and the sequel is A Voice in the Darkness. Hello, David. Thank you for watching. Uh, and it's an interesting little story behind the how the story with eyes open came about. I had not long after I moved down here to Florida in late '97, I was trying a writing exercise, and it was turn the television on, turn to any random channel, write down the first line of dialogue that you hear, and then write a story from that. And the first, and I did that. So the first line of dialogue um, that I heard was, "Wasn't there something you wanted to tell me about your marriage?" So I wrote that down and started writing it. I had an initial scene of a woman confronting this guy she's been seeing. She had thought he was single, but it turns out that he's married, and she was basically an affair he was having behind his wife's back, and she was not happy about it. But it really wasn't working. It wasn't going anywhere beyond that first initial idea. So I put it down for a little while, and then when I came back to it, I had an idea of where it could go. Do you ever be sitting there alone in a room? You know you're alone, but out of the corner of your eye, you see movement. Now I have a cat, so half the time it's usually her, but sometimes she'll be on the other side of the room from where I'm seeing the motion. And I look, and of course there's nothing there. It's just my mind playing tricks on me. But then I started wondering, what if there was another race living here on Earth with us, a race that we can't see, can't touch, can't feel, can't interact with in any way, shape, or form, and they like it that way. But they need a human to anchor them to Earth, and that's where With Eyes Open came from. It grew out from there. The main character of Mira Frayne grew out from there. I decided to make her not quite a telepath, or seeing as it's set in the 21st century, a mystic. I'll get into that later. Um, Without going into too many spoilers, she ends up being linked to these creatures, and not quite immortal, because eventually she will die. It's just going to take about 1,000 years. It was a quick little story to write. Excuse me. Nectar of life. It was a quick little story to write, and always was one of my favorites. And I always knew that somewhere along the line that I would be writing a sequel to it. I just didn't know when, and didn't know what exactly I was going to do. I I always knew that somewhere I would write Mira's last story, when she turns the reins over to somebody else, but haven't gotten to that one yet. The sequel was never really planned to be a sequel. I started writing A Voice in the Darkness, initially thinking about an experiment that goes out of control on an orbital laboratory. And I started going from there, and then, seeing as my subconscious works without me knowing about it sometimes, all of a sudden, there's Mira. And I stopped for a while, and I thought about it. It's like, why would Mira be there? Then I started thinking about the nature of the experiment that was getting out of control. It's set in the 2199, and the main character's ex-husband was working on essentially a deflector shield, to use a Star Trek terminology, that would essentially phase things out of excuse me, my mind just went blank. Would phase things out of reality, making them undetectable, invisible, and all that. And it took me a little while to see that connection, and once I saw it, bam. The creatures known as Adichas are out of phase, and if you passed out of phase with the world around you, you would be able to detect them, and they're not happy about that. So Mira and the Adichas are up on the station trying to stop the experiment. One thing leads to another. Also leads to the creation of another one of my favorite characters, Mandalay Flynn. Do not call her Manda. She hates that. So, and it's also lays a little bit of a groundwork for what comes ahead in the future stories. Now, just to sidetrack a little bit here, just want to mention that all the stories, all 7 books, and everything that comes after it, every story I've ever written, all takes place in the same timeline, stretching from 13.8 billion years plus 1 day in the past to right now about the year 7869, excuse me, which is when Brianna and the 3 is set. I do this because everything affects everything else. So in A Voice in the Darkness, there is a character that's mentioned who shows up in one story that's in Campfire Stories. She shows up again in On a Cold Wind, and I'm currently working on her own story, or one of her stories right now. It's called Wanderer, working on it at the moment. And so it is kind of, there are a few spoilers in there. And basically everything interacts with everything else. So in one story that's about an author, in another story you may get somebody referencing to the fact that they like this guy's writing, or one author references another author. I have a lot of writers in my fictional universe. So we look ahead now, and with eyes open, it was the very first thing. It's not the first thing I ever had published. I did have a few stories published in the past. With Eyes Open itself was published on an online magazine. The problem was I was starting to get real tired of sending the stories out and having an editor say, "Well, it's not for us. I've just sent you every story that I have got." What you know. So that was one of the reasons why I started self-publishing, and I decided to start small with this little two-page, two-story piece, just to test the waters. And I actually enjoyed the process of putting putting first the ebook together, and then later on the print-on-demand copy. Uh, I've gotten pretty good at it now. I can pretty much do it automatically, and it is kind of fun putting a cover together. Although I would could really use some help on advertising, but that's another uh, vlog post. Um, and if you look at the two stories, if you look at them, are pretty emblematic my my writing style. I write in plain English. I try not to use a lot of technical terms, and most of my main characters are women. Uh, as to that last point, I'm not 100% sure as to why. It's just something that I do. Uh, I think maybe subconsciously I'm not in the stories in the books and stories that I read. I'm not finding the kinds of characters that I'm looking for, so I decided to create them. I think it was Toni Morrison said, if there's a book you want to read and it hasn't been written, go ahead and write it. Um, so that's what I'm doing. I'm writing the stories that I like to read, and hopefully there are people out there who like to read them also. Um, Advertising, I suppose, will come as I go along. So that's about it for now. So we're just getting back into it. I'll probably do the next one, probably in about 2 weeks. It'll be on the next book, Campfire Stories. It'll be a little bit longer because there's 8 stories in Campfire Stories, and I'll go over each one individually. Um, if if you want to buy the books, check out my website. It's Word Boys Words, the website of Michael P. Dunn, and it's the address, and I'll also put this down in the comments. It's wordboy1.wixsite.com/wordboyswords, and like I said, I'll put that down um, in the comments. If you want to check the previous on writing and such videos, I do have a channel um, on YouTube. Excuse me. Um, and that's a very long address, so I'll just put that down in the comments section below. If you have any questions, anything you want to ask me, anything you want me to address in a future video, why do I think anybody would want to listen to me? Why am I sitting here babbling aimlessly? Or if you have any questions about the stories themselves, just put them down in the comments below, and I will do my best to address them. And so that's about it for now. Thank you, David, again for listening and watching, and I'll end with one of my favorite Neil Gaiman quotes. I actually have it pinned up here over my desk. Being a writer is a very particular sort of job. It's always you versus a blank sheet of paper or a blank screen, and quite often the blank piece of paper wins. So, and later on I have editing to do and fighting that blank piece of paper. So, thank you for watching. Have a great day, and see you in 2 weeks